to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks, and today we're going to be doing a really cool two-parter episode. So this will be part one. Our guests today were down in South America visiting Peru and Bolivia. And sure, they did lots of hiking, biking, and paddling, but they also had a true cultural immersion, which makes this trip especially special. And just so you know, no, we're talking about Peru. We're not talking about Machu Picchu, which we covered in episode 14. It's just a super interesting and complex trip that today we'll be focusing on the Peru section of their adventure, and then next time we'll be talking about their Bolivian section when we go to the salt flats and much more. And after that, I'll also speak a little bit about the history of the fascinating Inca peoples at the end of the second part of this episode. So let's get started. Could you please start by introducing yourselves and perhaps telling us your age?
Okay, I'm Susan Brickey, and I'm 72 years old. I turned 72 on this trip.
Very cool. And we also have with us Richard. Richard, how about you?
Yeah, Richard Pope, and I am 66. Born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I've done a fair amount of traveling, but I met Sue through a social media site. I at least got to know her through that and saw how much she was traveling. And so we really clicked.
So how did you guys get interested in adventure travel?
I think both of us have always just been outdoor people. We like to hike and bike and canoe or kayak. And we love the out of doors. So before we saw each other on social media, we'd been part of an outdoor club in Portland called the Mazamas, which is both a climbing and hiking club. So we just love being in the out of doors.
And I think just looking at our backgrounds, we had a kind of different approach to the outdoors in our earlier years because we both worked full time, but Sue was really, I call it workaholic. She was very, very busy in her job. And I was like, it's 4:00. It's time to get out of here and do something. And I had a very generous vacation policy in my working years. So I traveled a lot domestically, at least when I was pretty young and had been traveling a long time. And then Sue jumped in when she retired and just traveled everywhere and was just always on the go. And I got impressed with her travel, wild
diversity.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Well, now, were you doing adventure travel or just general travel? See, I didn't even discover this adventure travel thing until really late. I just assumed that you just went and did this. You know, you go there, you see the cities and the cultural and historical sites, and you turn around and come home. You know, I totally forgot that there's beautiful landscapes and national parks all over the world. Did you always do the adventures part, the outdoor stuff, or was that something new later on?
I think for me, it started from an early age. I grew up in a very small family, but my father worked for the Forest Service and took us out in the woods all the time. And our vacations were camping. I mean, I think one time I went to Disneyland like everyone else, but generally we went camping, the North Cascades, all over Oregon, down into California. So I sort of got that as an early age. And then I started on my own. I started backpacking, bike touring, bicycle to San Francisco, bicycle all around Oregon, did some of those kind of trips. And so all of my trips have pretty much been centered around some kind of outdoor activity. Nothing wrong with seeing a museum. It's nice to get some cultural education as well. But to me, the core was really being outdoors.
Definitely. How about you, Susan?
I think using our bodies out of doors, there's a piece of really wanting to be strong or to feel the strength as you're out there in nature. So I think I've always chosen adventures where you can see a new part of the world, but while you're exploring that part of the world, you're using your body to bicycle, to kayak, to move yourself through it. So I think I've always had an interest in that. Some of my travel when I was younger was with work, and it was a little harder to get out, but I always managed to do at least one outside activity and an adventure on any kind of business travel too.
I'm so envious. That's so cool. So today we're talking about your chinchilla trip where you went to Peru and Bolivia. And most people, when they think Peru, they're Machu Picchu, but you took a different route. What made you choose this particular adventure?
I think it was the intrigue of Bolivia just sounds like a little more off the beaten path. We actually did travel to Peru immediately prior to Bolivia, and this was a natural extension of that trip for us. So we just wanted to add that on and see the intrigue of Bolivia. Just had a lot more political upheaval, and I think some people were maybe afraid to go there, but it turns out it's quite safe as long as you take the standard precautions. anywhere when you travel.
So when we were traveling in Peru, we ran into a group of Canadians who were there working in some of the schools. And one of the professors from Canada told us that he had spent a lot of time in Bolivia and he considered it the safest country in South America. I found that interesting.
Definitely.
Also, I was interested in going to Bolivia because of Lake Titicaca. Of course, you can go to that lake from either Peru or Bolivia. But since a child, I have been interested in Lake Titicaca. Just the name of it, I think, was intriguing when you're 5 or 6 years old. It is the highest lake in the world, or navigable lake.
Yeah, navigable, I believe it is. Yep. Yeah, and big container ships because it's huge and is deep.
Right. Yeah, that's the unique thing about Titicaca is the altitude combined with the fact that you can see some fairly large boats on it. And you just have to kind of remind yourself of how high it really is. And you realize when you're on Lake Titicaca looking around, everything is higher than you, which is kind of mind blowing. You're already at 12,500 feet. You look up and see the mountains at 23,000 feet, and even the hills around you are higher than you. So the altitude takes a little getting used to, but it's quite exhilarating to be there.
I want to talk to you about that. So you fly into Cusco, which is also very high. Did you sense the altitude when you got out, or talk a little bit about that?
Actually, our experience, I think, is similar to some of our friends who talked about this. When you get off the plane at Cusco, the airport's flat, and you take a taxi, and then you get to your hotel, and you have to go up 2 flights of stairs, and that's pretty much when it hits everybody. When you walk up a hill, you suddenly realize that you're out of breath, like instantly. So just sitting at a coffee shop, walking along a sidewalk, you don't notice it. We didn't notice it too much, I should say, but uphill stairs, hill climbs immediately bring it to note that you're someplace different.
We actually arrived at Cusco 2 days early to give ourselves a little bit more time to acclimate before we started being active. And I think that's a good idea.
I was going to ask you if you would recommend that because it sounds, I know for me, because I'm altitude challenged, once I start feeling it around 8,000 and the highest I've been was 12,500 and I had a little mild headache, a little bit of queasiness, but to just bang. And that was when I took all day to get up to that high. So I can't imagine you just get off the plane and boom, you're there.
Yeah. The one thing it's hard to predict for the most part, if you live in the States here, of course, is it's especially on a trip the time of year we went, you cannot train at altitude in Oregon in April, really, unless you do winter mountaineering. So unless you've had experience at altitude, it's a bit of a risk. We both went to travel clinics and had Diamox prescribed for us, which can help you acclimate. We took a little bit of that, and it's probably a good idea for a lot of people to give that a try or consult their physicians. I'm not sure it did that much good, but neither one of us had altitude sickness symptoms at all. Just a little shortness of breath, which is you have to expect. You're not going to perform like you do at sea level.
Right. And I will put in the show notes and on the website some other altitude things. There's an Altolab that I use that I trained for in Bhutan. I'll put information on that. And also, I believe the pill you took is the same thing that I took when I went to Bhutan as well. All right. So tell us a little bit about Cusco itself. It sounds like a really cool town or city. I guess it is.
We were in the old town. Our hotel was right just a block away from the main market. Would you call it a market? From the main city square. And one thing I found delightful was that there was always activities on that square. I was trying to remember if they were only on the weekend, but there was a big military march and presentation with all different kinds of military there. And at the same time, there were all the regional people from different parts of the mountains surrounding it in their costumes. And so that was very, very fun. There was lots of activity there, lots of museums. Of course, there were many people trying to sell their wares, but they mostly took no for an answer or no thank you. We were always very polite.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of street vendors in Cusco. You'll see one on every corner. And I think the main squares, there are activities on weekends, but we found like any excuse for celebration. It seems like evenings, people are out, the native dances going on, especially during the tourist season, which is, we were sort of starting into the part of the higher travel season in May when we were there.
We were also delighted to find that there were excellent restaurants. Now, neither of us is really a foodie. We don't particularly care. We get by on oatmeal and peanut butter sandwiches, but it was included in our trip, and our guide took us to some really excellent restaurants with quite a few different foods and in different neighborhoods of the city. We walked everywhere. It is easy to walk. Now, from the city square, you were often walking uphill. But like we said, it was not challenge. We didn't find it a difficult challenge.
I know in Bolivia, I think when I see the photos, you see them in their beautiful native dress or whatever their traditional dress. Do you see that a lot in Peru as well? Or because they just make stunning weavings and stunning fabrics?
Very definitely, especially the women wear a traditional garb when they're downtown. I think a lot of them kind of cling to those traditions. There's, of course, a lot of modern Peruvians that dress very, you'll see Nike, all kinds of name brands walking down the street. But a lot of the older women and even the younger women that want to get into the trades, weaving and handicrafts, will wear the very colorful shawls and the bowler hats. And the hats are kind of regional too. You can, we of course never got good enough to do this, but you can tell where someone's from by the color they're wearing, the style, the type of hat they have. It's very, very regional specific.
And interestingly enough, before we went on the chinchilla trip, we were in Peru and hiking, and we were way out the Laras Valley of the Sacred Valley. And we hiked, and it was just our guide, another guide with a mule in case we needed a ride along the way. And we were hiking, and we saw no other people except occasionally a Peruvian woman, and she would be dressed in that traditional garb. And we were quite a long way out in the country. So I don't know whether she was going into a market where she wanted to be in her traditional clothes or if that's what she actually wore on a daily basis.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. I remember in Bhutan too, a lot of people still wore as their national dress. In fact, a lot of places you couldn't go into unless you were in national dress. So it really makes you feel like you're truly in an exotic place. Now, you also did a hike up to the fortress. I'm going to butcher this. The Sacsayhuaman Fortress, the House of the Sun.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is Sacsayhuaman is a fortress that was built by the Incans and started in the mid 1400s. And it was, I believe it took something like 40 years to complete. So you look at the stonework, it's probably one of the finest examples we saw of Incan stonework in all our visits to this region. It's still kind of a mystery how it was built, but we know why it was built. It was certainly a place of worship. The high priest would live up there, and they use it as kind of a astronomical observatory. It's actually a large area that can be flooded. The canals are still there. The stonework is still in place. When you flood this, it acts as a reflecting pond, and you can see the stars at night. And they could predict from their astronomical observations the movement of the stars in certain kinds of seasons, and that kind of gave them a bit of a power and a bit of awe over the lower class. So that was one of the prime reasons was an observatory for the high priesthood. And of course, it also has a high and mighty place. It's probably 700 to 800 feet above the downtown Cusco. So you get great views and sort of that feeling of looking down on the others. It's quite impressive. And of course, the name Sacsayhuaman is local Quechuan, but it also, because of English-speaking people, it sounds like sexy woman, which is always kind of a local joke. It's one way to remember it, at least.
And I must say that I really enjoyed that ruin. I think in some ways it's not near as complex as Machu Picchu, but in terms of a feeling of magnificence and simplicity and the detail of huge rocks. I would say there are more large rocks there perfectly put together than there are in Machu Picchu. So I would encourage people to go there and see it. It's so close to Cusco. We walked there. Of course, traveling with active adventures, you're always doing something active every day. And I really enjoyed our visit there.
And from what I read, those large stones were supposed to represent jaguars' teeth. And they said that some of them can weigh like 143 tons each. I mean, so is it like the surrounding, like the jaw of the jaguar? Did they tell you anything about that? That just sounded really cool when I was researching it.
I mean, you have to use your imagination. It's a bit symbolic, but yeah, if you imagine just a very flat, grassy field with these big, jagged rocks sticking out of it, you could certainly envision that as being the jaw, where there's multiple high rocks that's sort of like a jagged bunch of teeth. You didn't jump out at me and say, "Oh, this is a jaguar," but if you're told that, you could certainly try to visualize it.
And there's a place where you stand parallel to those lines of rocks that are called the teeth, and you can see down.
And then I want to mention too, at the end of our interview, I was so fascinated by the Inca people that I'm going to go a little long on talking about the Inca history. So those that are interested, stay tuned after the interview. But just to give you an idea of how sophisticated these people were, they were able to do this. They had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals. I think they had llamas and alpacas, but they didn't have like ox or horses or anything. So no horses. They had no iron or steel. And at the time, they still had no method of writing. They used little knots and stuff like that. So they were able to figure out how to do all that with like nothing. Amazing civilization. And so, like I said, stay tuned after the interview and you'll hear a whole bunch more about it. And so from Cusco, you went to Pisac. Okay. And that's in the Sacred Valley. Tell us a little bit about that.
Pisac is another Incan ruin, and what sets it a bit apart from some of the other ones is it was primarily a place where people went to be buried or to die. It was, again, a very high place, very sacred, and there are a number of tombs right across the viewing spot where the people were embalmed or set up for their passage into the next world. And across the valley, very short distance, you can see a wall with dozens and dozens of holes in them, and those are each little burial site. So that was the primary purpose of Pisac, was a place to go to the next world.
We also hiked up to it on what was an Inca trail, and we were told that those Inca trails were used to drive their alpaca or llamas to the market. So it was very wide, maybe 8 feet, and very even stonework for walking, unlike the Inca trail that people think of hiking into Machu Picchu. It was wider, and any steps were a little smoother. And then we did hike around inside of Pisac and could see there are multiple small dwelling ruins that you could look out of. And I thought that was just another fascinating ruin to see and to visit.
Yeah, it sounds cool. Now you're looking down over the whole valley from up there too, right?
Oh yeah, easily 2,000 feet above the valley here. So it's the views in all directions are really spectacular.
And it was one of the first times that I noticed the terraces. You see terraces everywhere. And they talk about the purpose of terraces, and we think of it primarily as agricultural. But we saw so many of them on islands and every place. And I think there was a huge population of Incans. But did they really need to terrace the land that deeply to be able to feed this large group of people? And then our guide said that they also terraced to avoid huge mudslides because the slopes are so steep. And I thought, you could understand if a village got totally wiped out by a mudslide, they might start terracing.
Yeah, the terraces, I think, is fascinating. Just their stonework is just amazing. So, and then from Pisac, then now you went down, you did a little bit of cycling down to Puno?
Yes, we cycled through 3 small villages. After we cycled through the 3 small villages, we cycled in what I would have called a wetland or wilderness area. And that was also a very special moment for me on the trip. We got off of our bicycles and climbed up onto a viewing platform, and you could see the wetlands and the water and the birds, and it was just beautiful. So it was not a very strenuous bike ride, but it was just gorgeous. And while we were at the end of the bike ride, or near the end of the bike ride, we came upon a pre-Incan ruin, and it was just fascinating to watch. And the guide said to us, well, there's still pottery shards around here, and you can just find them just across the street. They're all over the place, and you can take them home. And of course, we're so trained, you don't take anything home, historic. But we did go across the street and immediately found some shards, and we're very thrilled with that. Because how old was that site, Rick?
So yeah, it's people just think of Peru and Bolivia and they think of the Incans and nothing else. And there actually they were a fairly short-lived civilization when you think about it. And I know you'll cover that in the post-podcast information, but this was basically a village built by the Wari people, Wari, and they date back to about the year 800, which predates the Incan civilization by a good probably 400, 500 years, something like that. And there was stonework that was sort of in ruins, and it wasn't the level that you saw that the Incas did later on. but it was sturdy enough to certainly get the job done. They just didn't polish it up and make it look.
Interesting. And the towns that you went through,
Oh, just small villages.
yeah, it sounded like they each had a different personality or a different thing they were famous for. Like one was the Seya or Sela, the pork chicharron, one of the food favorites. The other one is famous for, it's the land of the priests, the Pagos. Could you tell us a little bit about the personality traits of the different towns that you went to?
We didn't notice a huge difference. I mean, you certainly just can't look at a town and tell exactly what it's famous for, but you realize that they get reputations based on, again, the food they provide. The chuta bread at Oropeso was a specialty. You could smell the bread baking when you went into town. That was pretty cool. But they were all typical little Peruvian towns with very narrow cobbled streets, just wide enough for a car to get by, because they were, of course, built before automobiles. So it's kind of lucky just to get a delivery truck down some of the streets. Kind of amazing they can even do it.
One of the streets, a woman was sweeping ahead of us with a handmade broom and was quite delighted by the fact that we were bicycling through. And she tried to talk to me, and unfortunately, we had no common language, but it was still just a magical moment. The streets are uneven enough that the other traveling companion with us was very uncomfortable with bicycling on them, even though we were on bigger tires. But I think we felt very safe and comfortable. And we did get to try the bread warm out of the oven, and it was just delightful.
Were most of the people very welcoming and glad to see you as the tourist?
I think so. I mean, I wouldn't say the people were necessarily outgoing, but they certainly were friendly. And of course, it may depend a little bit on whether they're trying to sell you something. A lot of people honestly make a huge living off of tourism. It's a big thing down there. A lot of people make handicrafts. And so people on the streets that are selling things are naturally more eager to approach you than people who may be just going about their daily business. We certainly felt no ill will towards us anywhere. The level of friendliness just depended a bit on, their angle.
An interesting observation, I think. I was just thinking about the town where the bread is made. We stopped and took a picture of ourselves bicycling in front of an old church. But when we looked around, we saw more dogs than we did see people. There are many wild dogs, or partially, I guess maybe I'd call them feral. We also understand as we ask about this that people have pet dogs and they will have collars, and some love to dress up their dogs in coats. So you saw a lot of dogs in little pet coats, but none of them were aggressive. We never felt threatened by them. There were just many numbers of them.
Now, because you're with active and you're, like I said, you're being active, you're biking or you're hiking and all that. Once you got away from the main tourist areas, did you see many other tourists, or were you kind of like the oddball out? Did you see many Westerners?
Well, I think we did see Westerners. We did visit places like the Reed Islands on Lake Titicaca are probably the most popular thing there is to do on the Lake Titicaca is to visit the Reed Islands. So we were definitely not alone there. I think they took us to some of the smaller islands where we only saw maybe 2 small boatloads of people to dozens of boatloads. So the most off the beaten path we were was probably earlier in Peru, but on the Chinchilla trip, it was a fair amount of other tourists around, but never crowded.
And then the day after you went on all the cycling through the little villages, then you were hiking up Tequila Island. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. And it's not that high. Again, you're at elevation, so you feel it you're probably at about 13,000 feet on Tequila. It's just a beautiful little island, volcanic. It looks like a volcanic island, just pops straight up out of the lake. And there is a main square, and a walkway up to it was built just recently with some funds received from, I believe, tourist dollars. So it's a nice, beautiful stone walkway through an arch, and it leads up to the town square. And then we were able to have a hot lunch, like fresh fried fish right out of the lake, which was really great. And a view of, I think this is one of the first places we could really see the Andean mountain chain was from Tequila Island. Look across the waters and you see snow-capped peaks in the distance that are just incredibly beautiful.
Nice. Now, is that where you did the homestay?
Actually, the next island after Tequila, which was our lunch stop.
Okay.
Got back on a boat and went across to Amatani Island. Again, walked up a short distance to our homestay family, in which they were very close to their town square as well, and then spent the night with them.
And so tell us a little bit about the homestay. That sounds kind of cool. And did you have language barriers, or how does all that work?
Well, we had our guide who could speak both Quechua and, of course, Spanish. I don't know if he spoke a little
a little Aymara possibly too. That's a fairly common language in this area is Aymara, which is another ancient language.
But one of the things I found interesting was we were greeted at the dock by the woman whose home we were going to stay in. And she was dressed in her traditional costume. And she brought a very big, colorful wrap. And she carried our day packs. We had a overpack actually for this trip. And she just wrapped them in the blanket around her shoulder. She was I'm 5'6", and she came to my shoulder in height. But she just wrapped our bags in that thing and started up the hill. And that was probably my second most challenging hill. I'm not quite sure why, but I was walking very slowly with just my weight, and she was carrying all these bags and climbing up the hill. And it was beautiful. She was able to point out her home to us from the boat dock. Frankly, I expected our lodgings to be quite uncomfortable and very basic, but we got into her home and there were, right in our area, there were three little, what I would call like motel rooms, actually. They were individually decorated. They each had some view of the waterfront and they were quite comfortable. And there were two Western style toilets with some running water. So we got checked into our rooms. I would say checked in as we arrived at our rooms and got comfortable. And then her husband led us up to the community where there was actually an intramural volleyball championship going on with what we would consider to be the high school level. And the whole community was there. And we managed just to squeeze into a corner and watch some of the girl volleyball, which was quite fun. And we had a cup of hot chocolate out on the town square. It got quite cool there that night. And then we went back to our homestay location for dinner. And we ate in their little community cook room for that dinner. It was quite a small room, maybe 8 by 8. And she had a stove top and then a earthen oven and made us quite a lovely meal. And frankly, I wasn't sure it was the same lady because she was dressed in more work clothes. You know, she was dressed in her kitchen cooking clothes. And it took me a while to make sure this was the same face and the same woman and maybe not someone that she had helping her. But we had quite a healthy, wholesome meal, and that felt very traditional to me. I felt like we were in a kitchen that was used daily by her family in this community. And then we had quite a restful night. And the next morning, they have built a bigger room that could be a banquet room. And she actually served us breakfast up there. So the breakfast was carried up to us by the husband. They also had a son. They were very warm and welcoming people and took a lot of care to make sure that their premises were clean and working. We could have used a little more food for breakfast, I think. But they had asked us how many eggs to prepare, and they had suggested a number like 5 or 7. And we would have had an opportunity to say, gee, we think we need a little more than that. There were 3 of us traveling together and our guide. And so the breakfast was for all of us. But the views out of that larger room of Lake Titicaca and the mountains were just lovely. So it was a very, very nice experience with a touch of rusticness, but really quite comfortable.
Was there anything unusual in the house that you said, oh, wow, that's an interesting way to do something or to live that's like totally alien to how we would live?
No, I think, like Sue said, that some of the fixtures are things like we're used to, but their cooking was a little more rustic. It's like an earthen oven. She did a combination of cooking on propane burners and sort of a wood-stoked fire in an earth oven that she was baking things in. So that was probably a little bit unusual. And of course, all the decorations were hand woven or handmade. So that gave kind of an air of, you're not in Oregon anymore.
I would say the room the kitchen was in, the area where the kitchen was built, was small. And I'm thinking they were mud walls. They weren't wooden. What would you say, Rick?
It looks more like adobe to me.
Yes.
Interesting. And then let's talk about food in general. How was the food on your trip?
It was good. I mean, I think both in Peru and Bolivia, they brag about how many varieties of potatoes. It's kind of hard to believe that they claim they have 4,000 varieties of potatoes. So you could probably spend a couple of years down there and never repeat. So that's a pretty staple part of the diet, a lot of potatoes. A lot of the meat comes from, they do have cattle down there, but chicken is really, really popular. So it's really pretty basic food, but with just a little bit of South American spice and, flavor to it, a little bit of a tilt towards exotic foods, but stuff that we pretty much recognized.
So, Rick, did you ate more llama or alpaca? Which was it that?
I'm ashamed to admit that, but yes, I mean, they're so cute and cuddly, but, when in Rome, so I decided there was llama on the meals in several places. And it's a perfectly, if you eat beef in this country, you'll eat llama down there. It's a perfectly acceptable meat, and it tastes, tastes a bit beef-like.
They raise it specifically for that as well as for the fabric. I would say every meal we had was quite good. Again, our guide was very skilled at finding nice restaurants.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, the next day you had a really fun day. You were sea kayaking in the Reed Islands. Tell us about that. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Right. So we woke up on Amatani Island, and you have to realize Lake Titicaca is big. It's 105 miles north to south, tip to tip, and any kind of a breeze can build up. And so we looked out, and there's a pretty heavy chop. There's the minor whitecaps out there, and the guide wisely suggested that we, rather than kayak directly from our homestay location, that we get back in the motor launch, which was going to accompany us anyhow, and basically head back towards Puno and get into the shelter of a peninsula, which cut the wind chop down. So we started the day motoring across the lake for an hour or two, and then landed and got our kayak gear on, and then we were able to kayak along the shore of the lake and pretty much explore all the shoreline. We saw a number of grebes, a few shorebirds, which was kind of cool. And then we were able to go out and see some netted fish farms where they're raising fish right in the lake, in basically in nets. And then we got towards the Reed Islands, but then we actually motored into the Reed Islands to visit those after we put the kayaks on back on the boat.
And explain to us exactly what a Reed Island is.
So it's an interesting way to live. Supposedly, people down there developed this years ago just as a way to escape their enemies, but there are just natural reeds growing along sort of in the shallows of Lake Titicaca, and these reeds have roots that go down. But if you can take these root blocks and chop them up, and the reeds actually float. So you take big blocks of reeds, several feet square, and you start lashing them all together and anchor them. And then you, on these green reeds, you lay down old dead reeds in a crisscross pattern. You end up with a floating island. And the islands are connected or separated by waterways, just depending on how you want to live. And usually several small families will live on each of these islands, depending on how big they are. And they get along in reed boats. So while the island is floating, it's hard to really feel it because there's not much of no big waves, at least where we were. There's just a slight feeling of rocking when you're on the island.
Rick was actually observing how they were cooking because people would say, well, wouldn't fires be an issue on Reed Island? So maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I knew that these people cook a lot with wood fires, and I thought it's a bit dangerous starting a fire on an island made of dry reeds. That basically the whole thing would go up in a flash. But they have these little ingenious ceramic pots they build fires in, and so it's like basically a ceramic cook stove. So you can light a fire within the pot, and it's pretty safe if you keep an eye on it. So they cook and smoke things on that.
The other thing they did was take homes. We were actually on a smaller island since there were only 3 of us and our guides. So they took us to an island where 6 families live. And the mayor, in quotes, the mayor was a young woman who explained to us and demonstrated how the Reed Islands were built and how they have to renew them periodically. And then they separated us, and each of us got to go into one of their homes, which was pretty interesting. They tended to be one-room homes. Some of the islands have a community water bathhouse with a solar panel on it. We did see solar panels, which we didn't hear that people who've gone before us had seen, so that may be a newer invention. So we tended to have mostly women and children on the island. I believe that men were actually off working in Puno. But we had a magical moment. I got dressed in native costume, and Rick posted one of those pictures on your website, so it's there. So we went for a ride on the reed boat, which have like cat heads on each side. Both Rick and I tried to paddle so we could experience what it was like to move that big boat through the water. And it was tough. It was very hard and challenging. And then when we came back from the ride, the women of the village sang to us. And I videoed it, and it was quite a special moment. But I turned off my video right at the time where they finished their song and they sang,
Hasta la vista, baby.
it was really quite funny.
Oh, how funny. How big are these boats? I mean, a reed boat, that sounds kind of interesting.
Traditional reed boats, I think, were more like the size of kayaks. But then as, family, they wanted to move larger goods, bigger families. It's like catamarans. You've got basically two reed boats that are shaped a bit like a kayak, but of course much bigger. They're probably 20 feet long on each pontoon, and then a platform connecting the two, which can have actually a viewing platform on top of that. So the whole boat's 20, 25 feet long and about probably 6 feet wide. That's on average.
It's bigger than I was thinking. I'm glad you described it.
Yeah, and when Sue talked about trying to paddle it being hard, I mean, made out of reeds, but they're big and heavy. The reeds are just solid bundles. And then the oars, a nice kayak paddle nowadays is made out of aluminum and carbon fiber. These oars are carved out of big solid wood. The oar itself weighs so much that it's hard just to pick it up and move it. And then you're moving this, several ton reed boat. So it's you don't make exactly quick time, but the community's not that large, so you can get by at a fairly slow pace.
And just for perspective too, I read that the largest of these reed islands are about half the size of a football field, so they're really not that large. How far off from the mainland were the ones that you visited?
Really, probably only a couple of miles, 2 to 3 miles. You can see Puno from the reed islands that we were on, so they're not terribly remote like they used to be. And people nowadays, when they want to go into town, they use aluminum boats with outboard motors. They're not totally traditional like they used to be. A fair amount of the tradition is based on tourism, and which is fine. They can still do the old world crafts and the old way of doing things, but they're willing to conform to the modern world where it's convenient.
And you were referring earlier too about how the reed islands are originally formed because from what I read, the people that migrated there, they were not welcomed when they got there, so they ended up making the islands out in the middle of the lake. But apparently in 1986, there was a really big storm which destroyed a lot of the islands. So that now they've moved them closer to the mainland because they don't have the friction anymore. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
And they did say that there are 100 of these reed islands. Can't remember what the population was.
In this one area that we visited, yeah.
Did you ask can anybody just build an island if they want to now? If they want to just have some land and just build an island?
I suspect so, but I imagine that there is a governing body that for this community, and then each island sort of has its own governance. And I think to fit in, you'd probably want to consult them and see if you could fit in the community and have a space to build an island. There's certainly no shortage of reeds that we saw.
We're going to pick up the rest of this interview in part 2 of this adventure when we come back in 2 weeks. So we'll stop here as we're switching countries. I just love how Susan and Richard got to really get a feel for the whole country, not just doing the adventures like we normally do, but they really got to meet a lot of the local people, which I think is super special. They got to talk to the mayor on the Reed Island. They did a homestay and the little local restaurants instead of all the touristy places, and just had a whole lot of encounters with locals. So I think this has been a really special trip. Plus, even non-history buffs have got to be impressed with the Inca civilization. I'll be covering their history at the end of part 2 because not everybody that's listening to this program is into history. I want to just go a little bit more in depth for those that are interested because their culture and the civilization is remarkable. So I look forward to sharing that with you. If you want to get more details on this active adventure, one of my affiliate partners, Chinchilla Adventures, what Susan and Richard did was their 10-day tour, which does parts of Peru and then goes over to Bolivia. It's really cool because not only is it multi-sport where you are hiking, biking, and paddling, but also you have a cultural immersion and some cultural interaction experiences as well. So it's a really cool trip. And while we're on the topic of active adventures, I got a couple of emails from them recently that I want to share. They are really growing quickly and are expanding into Bhutan, one of my favorite countries, which I'll be going to next year, as well as they're also going to Africa. They're working on a safari trekking adventure that is in South Africa, Tanzania. They're going to Botswana, so it looks super cool. By the time this episode is released, those adventures should be posted on their website at activeadventures.com. Be sure to let them know that I sent you. I wanted to give you a heads up on these trips because I'm sure they're going to go very quickly, and I want to let you know that you heard it here first. Also, If you have not already, please subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and come back in 2 weeks where we will do part 2 and go to Bolivia, which I think is super cool. And if nothing else, go see the photographs of the salt flats. There's a stunning photo that I've got on the website that you can find at activetraveladventures.com/Bolivia and check those out. And next Thursday on our companion Adventure Travel Show podcast, where I teach you the how-tos of adventure travel, we're going to learn all the different ways to start a fire. Hopefully you're with a group and everybody's got everything under control, but it's a super important skill to learn just in case you find yourself out in the wild, in the cold. You need to know the different things you can do to start a fire to keep warm. So stay tuned for that next week. I thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on.